Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce for you tonight Jo Caswell. Jo is a seasoned early years expert. Jo has worn many hats over her vast career in early years. Jo is currently an early years consultant and has many years as a former Her Majesty's Inspector for early years. So Jo's well versed in the process that she's going to talk us through tonight. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us after, I'm sure everyone's had a long day at work. This is supposed to be a very informative session. I know there's been lots of information already published about the Ofsted inspection framework. I just wanted to give you like a step-by-step user-friendly guide in terms of what to expect when you have your inspection. So as I say, please feel free to note some questions and I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the session. So what this session is intended to be is literally a step-by-step process for what you can expect from the moment you get your notification call through to your inspection day and what to expect on the day. Obviously, all of the guidance has been published by Ofsted, all of the information is there, but this is just a step-by-step process to help explain that. The thing that's really important about this inspection framework is really you as leaders. And when I say leaders, I just want to clarify for our childminder colleagues that Ofsted is using the term leaders as a generic term for those who run a setting. So forgive me if you hear me saying leaders a lot and you think, well, I'm a childminder. I'm using that as a generic term for everybody, as is published in the Ofsted guidance. So the context of your setting is really important for you to know and be able to explain to the inspector about the children who attend and what you're doing to meet their needs. And we'll explore that in a little bit more detail as we go through the session. It's also a really good opportunity in this inspection framework for you to be able to demonstrate how well you know your setting, you know what's working well, and you know where your priority areas for development are and how you've identified those and what you're doing to achieve those. Inclusion, as we know, is a really integral part of this inspection framework. So how can we demonstrate we're meeting the needs of all the children who attend? How are we making sure our activities are inclusive, our curriculum program is inclusive, and how are we tailoring our service to meet the most vulnerable or disadvantaged children? We'll talk through this process about how your role is really key in how you can plan the inspection timetable with the inspector, how you can identify what the relevant inspection activities would be to demonstrate the typical program of activities in your nursery. We'll talk about the importance of safeguarding, because that hasn't changed, and how inspectors will make a judgment on that. And then the final part we'll touch on is how you will be involved with the inspector in looking at the grading of the standards and looking at the criteria in the inspection toolkit. Let's go to our first slide. So some slight changes in this new framework. You will be notified of an inspection if you're a group provider by 10 o'clock the working day before the inspection. So it's slightly different from how it used to be in the previous framework. So 10 o'clock, if you haven't had a call by 10 o'clock, you're not likely to have an inspection the next day. Obviously, Ofsted does still have a caveat where unannounced inspections can take place, but for routine planned inspections, you would get that call as a group provider by 10 o'clock. For childminder settings, obviously the call will be made at any time of the day, but no more than 5 working days before the inspection takes place. And the biggest difference in this framework as a childminder is that you'll have an agreed time for your inspection. So it's not in that window of days that it used to be in the previous framework. Another change in this setting in this framework that you might not have noticed, that term time only settings, Ofsted will not do inspections the first week back of term. So the first week of the September term, after Christmas and Easter, unless of course it is an unplanned inspection or Ofsted feels the need it is a priority inspection and it will still take place. But routine inspections won't take place that first week back after the main school holidays. And following the notification call, you'll then agree with the inspector a time to have a longer call, perhaps later that day or before the inspection takes place, called the planning call. And we'll talk about that and what is covered in that call a bit later on. When you've had your notification call, the nominated individual or the childminder will then receive an email from the inspector outlining some information that they're going to ask you to complete and then have available to be able to discuss with the inspector as part of the planning call. And that's talking about the types of children who attend, staffing qualifications, and any particular vulnerable groups of children that you may have on roll. And the inspector will use that information to plan the inspection timetable. Okay. So in the notification call, as before, the inspector will talk to the nursery manager or the most senior member of staff and then confirm that inspection is taking place the next day. As we said before, for childminder settings, you'll have a notification call and the inspector will discuss and agree an appropriate time when minded children are going to be present. The inspector will explain the role of the nominee, and that's really just for the larger group settings where it's going to be pertinent to have a nominee present, and we'll talk about that role a little bit later. The inspector will also ask if there's any reasonable adjustments that need to be made. So if there's any particular staffing issues that need to be made or any changes to the inspection programme or how the planning call is taking place, then it's really important that if this is needed, that you share this with the inspector and agree a way forward together. And also at that notification call, the inspector will confirm the key information about the settings, so opening hours, any changes to operational arrangements, things that the inspector would need to know. Okay. So you probably would have seen in the guidance, there is the role of the nominee now. Now, this is the person who basically is a runner on inspection day. They help the inspection run smoothly. They support the nursery manager, finding relevant information, organising meetings, perhaps dipping into a room to cover if an inspector needs to talk to a staff member. They make sure that they support the nursery manager in helping organise the running of the day. Now, the nursery manager can be present for some meetings if the manager feels that that's relevant. They can be part of the planning call, but they also need to know the setting well. So they need to have some sort of link from a senior level with that nursery. It can't just be some random person. It's got to be somebody who understands the operational needs of that nursery. And it's only really relevant for the very big settings. So please don't feel you have to have a nominee, but have a look in the operational guide for more information about that to help you understand if that's relevant or not. But what Ofsted has said in their guidance is that the nominee can't be present when the inspector's having confidential meetings with staff or parents. So just be aware of that. So in the planning call, this will be an online meeting like we're having today, or it might be a telephone call. So it depends on the inspector's arrangements. It normally lasts between 30 and 40 minutes. It depends on the context of your setting and the level of information that needs to be exchanged. So that's why you need to arrange to have the planning call at a time that suits you, a time that you can be able to focus on this and actually have that direct conversation with the inspector. And there'll be 3 elements to that planning call. So they'll talk about an introduction and discuss the practicalities of the inspection. They'll focus on the settings context, and then they'll start to plan the inspection timetable with the inspector. We'll talk about those 3 elements now. So discussing the practicalities is really important. And I think the key change for this inspection framework is the collaborative approach that you as a leader have with the inspector. So there's much more focus on establishing professional relationships, discussing what's working well, and actually sharing what's working well in your setting, being honest, having those professional discussions with the inspector. There's a very strong focus on provider wellbeing, and it's really important the inspector will check in on your wellbeing regularly, but also check that the staff are okay, and just ensure that any staff who are sensitive or anxious, that the inspector's made aware of that, so any key adjustments can be taken place. And also the inspector will make sure in that planning call that they share the relevant Ofsted helpline number with you. And again, that's another key change to this framework. So what's really important about this framework, and you'll have read it in the guidance, is the importance of leaders understanding the context of your setting. What makes your setting unique? Really important that that is understood. And as part of the inspector's planning, they will look at local authority data. They will look at the Explore Ofsted data. And in that data set, it supplies the information from each local authority, and it looks at deprivation levels, the funding take-up rates, early years pupil premium, health information, and sometimes oral health information, but that's not included for every local authority, particularly in the South East. There are some missing local authorities there. Now, this is obviously local authority-wide data, and it's just a starting point for the inspector's planning. So looking at actually what is the context of the local authority where your setting sits, and looking at actually potentially the starting point for what's the community that you serve, what are the needs of families in that area. So if you get a chance, have a look at that website. Just you can key in your local authority name, there's a drop down box, and then the information there under early years is quite self-explanatory. But as I say, it's just a starting point, Ofsted just use the inspectors use it to start looking at the local authority wide data. During the call, the inspector really needs to understand the area that you serve, the community that you serve, and the cohort of children who are on your roll at the present time. The inspector needs to draw out whether you're meeting the needs of the most disadvantaged children. That's the core element of the inspection. So the inspector needs to understand potentially who are your vulnerable children in your group, who is in receipt of additional funding for specific needs. Are there children on receipt of early years pupil premium? Do you have any children who have been assessed for SEN? All those sorts of vulnerabilities. And the key part of this new inspection framework is how well is the setting meeting the needs of the children who are more vulnerable, more disadvantaged, or there's barriers to their learning. So it's really important that you as a leader understand, are there children in my setting who are potentially more vulnerable than others? And how have I assessed this? And what am I doing to meet those children's needs? And you can talk about that with the inspector during the planning call. You can talk about the priorities that you've set for those children, how you've identified that they're vulnerable, and what you're doing to plug those gaps to make sure those children don't slip behind. And those conversations can start really easily during that planning call. And then you can scope the inspection timetable with the inspector to demonstrate what you're doing to meet those children's needs. And that's set out really clearly in the Ofsted guidance. So take a look at that when you get a chance. Inclusion, as we know, is a really key element, and inspectors will want to talk to you about how you're making your setting inclusive, how you're making sure your curriculum is accessible to all children. They want to know what the barriers to some of the children's learning are, and also who are the most vulnerable families. What are the issues that face those families in the community that you work with? How have you identified those? And what are you doing to plug those gaps to make sure those families and those children don't slip behind? It's really important that the inspector can identify that you actually understand your community, your cohort, and you're responsive to those changing needs. And they will change. It depends on the cohort, the area, demographic that you serve. So your knowledge of your setting, knowledge of your community, and your explanation of your priorities for improvement are really key to be able to demonstrate that you understand your setting and you're making the changes that are relevant to those children at the time. Sorry, my voice is going. I've been in a nursery all day and I can feel my voice going, so apologies. We'll soldier on. So your priorities for improvement, your action plans, all the things that you've got in place on a rolling basis are really important to be able to discuss with the inspector. You can talk about what you've done since the last inspection, all the positive changes that you've made. You can explain why you've made those changes. Why was it relevant at that time to put in place different strategies? Was it to meet particular children's needs? What did you do to achieve that? And what impact has it made? So it's really important that you demonstrate that you're proactive in responding to changing needs, you make the changes that are necessary, and then you measure their impact. And this planning call is a time to discuss those things, and then you can plan activities to discuss with the inspector to demonstrate the impact of that. So talk to the inspector about your families, talk about the vulnerable groups that you serve, talk about the vulnerabilities that face families in the area. How do you know this? How do you make sure that you're supporting those families and helping them to get the support that they need? One of the key things in the inspection framework, as we've seen, is the importance of helping parents understand that children should attend regularly, and the importance of regular attendance supports children's achievement. So how are you talking to parents about helping them understand the importance of attending regularly, being punctual, and help them understand that learning is important for the children. So those conversations you have with parents, with leaders, is really important to share with the inspector. And then you can talk to the inspector about how you're using the inspection toolkit to actually review your setting, think about where you feel where you sit, and why you've assessed yourself in that way, so that you can demonstrate those things together with the inspector during your inspection. So what the inspector will want to do is they'll listen to your priority areas for development. They'll listen to the cohort of children that you've got and talking about your explanation. And then together, they'll want to come up and plan an inspection timetable with you. They'll talk about the different inspection activities that you will be jointly involved with. So lots of focused leadership and discussions. Shared observations is a really key part of the new inspection framework. So if you've talked about the fact that you've got a cohort of children that perhaps you needed to do some intensive support around language development, you might want to do a shared observation with the inspector to demonstrate how you've done that. And then you can discuss the impact of that teach and the impact of the learning together with the inspector afterwards. The inspector would want to talk to other staff, obviously, and perhaps if you're a childminder and you're working with assistants, the inspector will want to involve the assistants in the inspection and talk to them about their knowledge of the children and their knowledge of the context that they serve as well, to see how well they're meeting those children's needs. And then together, you can identify other activities that you might want to complete to gain those to secure that evidence, to help the inspector understand your priorities and what you're doing to meet them. And obviously, as before, children will be fully involved in the inspection process. So when you plan the inspection timetable, think about what you want to demonstrate to an inspector. Think about what you want to celebrate. And the celebrate, validate and highlight are very clear in the inspection guidance and in the toolkit. It's really important that you talk to the inspector about what you feel is being done well in your setting. What are your key strengths? Why are they? Why are they making such a positive difference? What have you done to ensure that it's good provision and it's making a positive impact? Celebrate those aspects and let the inspector see those as positive aspects of your provision. Validate the issues that you know you still want to improve, or you might have done some work on something and you've noticed the positive difference that it's making. So that's showing that you're incisive and you're reflective and you know exactly what you need to do to make your provision even better. And then together with the inspector, you might highlight some areas that you still want to do a bit more work on, and actually that might add to some further improvements. And you'll know from the framework that the achieve, belong and thrive elements are really important in this framework about how we ensure children's learning is inclusive and how every child is valued in those elements. So when the inspector plans the inspection timetable with you, there's certain things that they will need to do at the beginning of the day. So obviously they will come at the start of the day and introduce themselves to you and the staff and the children, but also from a really early point in the inspection, the guidance is really clear that inspectors need to check some certain regulatory documentation, such as your first aid certificates. They'll have a discussion with the DSL to talk about any safeguarding elements in the nursery, and they'll also have a quick catch up and arrange a further meeting with the SENCO. If there's particular children that the SENCO is working with, that obviously the inspector might want to case sample as part of the inspection. It's always good at the beginning of any inspection, the inspector will meet the leadership team and talk with some parents to gather their feedback. And then the inspector will start to gather evidence about how you're using funding in your setting. So if you have all that type of information available at the start of the day, that helps the inspector plan the rest of the timetable with you based on what they need to see in your setting. And also at the beginning of the inspection, the guidance is clear that inspectors need to see confirmation of DBS checks. So always make sure you've got those readily available at the beginning of the inspection. And they'll sample some safer recruitment procedures just to check that those are all in place and meet requirements. I'm just going to quickly grab a mouthful of water, sorry, excuse me. So as before in the previous inspection framework, case sampling is a really important element of this framework, and the inspector will ask you at the planning call to think about some key children who would be good examples in the inspection to demonstrate the impact of your work in your setting. So if you've got any of those children that are listed on the screen in your setting, think about how you can explain their learning journey and the provision that you have in place for those particular children. So as we said, there is a focus on children who are known to be more disadvantaged, and particularly if they're in receipt of early years pupil premium free funding. But also if you've got a child that you're supporting through SEND, or any child who is previously known or is currently known to social care about safeguarding elements, their journeys will obviously be discussed in more detail. But think about any other child in your setting who may face other barriers to their learning. Think about their potential vulnerabilities. And there's also lots of different issues that could make a family vulnerable. So, as I say, you know the context of your setting. Think about the families that you're working with. Think about some children who really demonstrate the work that you've put in place, the focused attention, focused support, targeted learning, adapted your curriculum to meet those children's needs. And see how you can demonstrate that you've made a really significant difference to those children. Use this process of inspection to celebrate those changes and talk about those with the inspector. If you've got children who have or got a EHCP or any looked after child, again, make sure the key persons for those children are prepared to discuss that child's journey with the inspector as well. You don't need to have lots of different documentation. It can just be through informal discussion. And there's more information about the evidence the inspector would look for in the operating guide. So just make sure key staff are really familiar with that. But use the opportunity for case sampling to really allow the inspector to deep dive into particular children's learning journeys, as we say, to demonstrate that gaps in learning are closing in your setting. So after the inspector's planned all those activities with you, they'll obviously do the things that were very similar in other inspection frameworks. The observations of practice, discussions with children and staff are really key. And how those inspection activities are carried out depends on the size of your setting, your commitments as a leader. The inspector will fit around the timetable with you. You as a leader will be fully involved in the inspection process as much as you can be, but obviously inspectors will also understand if you need to dip into numbers, or if you already are in numbers, or obviously if you're a childminder, you're directly involved in the children anyway. The inspector will plan the timetable around your availability, and obviously to take account of what the children need as well. So, you know, it's a flexible programme, but make sure you use the time to make sure the inspector sees all the relevant evidence that they need to see. And any additional inspection activities will be agreed throughout the course of the inspection process. So at regular times during the inspection, the inspector will meet with the nursery manager or the childminder or the appointed manager to reflect on the evidence that they've gathered so far. So the new framework is a very transparent process, and you'll see through all the guidance that's been published that the inspector will regularly share their emerging feedback with you. They'll regularly look at the toolkit, they'll look at the grading standards and discuss with you where they're looking at the moment, where the evidence they've already seen, where it sits within the grading schedule. And you'll be very much part of those discussions. And it's really important that the inspector is seeing what is a typical day in your setting. So if for some reason you've got a key member of staff who's off, and your practice is not as typical as it would be normally, then it's really important that you have that discussion with the inspector to explain what's different today and what would be seen normally if that person was in. So the inspector really needs to see the grassroots level of what's typical for a child in your setting. So again, have the confidence to have those professional discussions with the inspector to explain how routines might run differently on a different day. It's okay to do that. And during the grading discussions, obviously the nursery manager, childminder will be fully included in all of those. So the emerging evidence, as we said, that will be jointly reviewed together. You'll be part of those discussions to discuss where the picture is looking. And obviously the grading schedule will be used with the evaluation in the toolkit, and the inspector will talk about which areas they consider as emerging strength, and where perhaps there's a bit more work to do to ensure a best fit for those grading standards. If the inspector needs to see more evidence, the nursery manager or childminder can actually suggest further things, and that's again where if it's a larger setting, the nominee can play a really key role there in helping to get those things organised. So it's your opportunity to say, oh, but you haven't seen this yet, I would really like you to see that. And it's really important that you have that competence to engage with an inspector and say, right, well, this would be really useful for you to see next. So make sure you use the inspection day to share with the inspector the evidence that you really want them to see. Now, if there are any areas emerging as that needs attention or urgent improvement, or if the inspector is going to suggest that safeguarding is going to be not met, they'd be having those discussions with you really early on. So they'd have that shared information and be discussing emerging feedback at the earliest stage, so that that's not a surprise at the end of the inspection. Safeguarding, we know that there's no major changes to how safeguarding is graded. Safeguarding is still a really important element of what we do in early years inspections. And there's no major changes to how the inspectors will gather evidence about that. The grading will be met or not met. But what the inspector will want to see is how you as a setting provide a positive safeguarding culture. They want to know that staff really understand what to do, what their role is, how they would identify if a child is at risk, and how they'd report concerns. And whistleblowing is a really key element of that. How well does the setting support whistleblowing within the setting? How well does staff understand how to escalate concerns if they're worried that staff are not taking sufficient action or leaders are not taking action? If there are major breaches in safeguarding and it results in a judgment of not met, then the overall judgment for leadership and governance will be graded as urgent improvement. And obviously you can see the link between that, and that would result in a re-inspection within 6 months. But again, if that was the case, the inspector would be discussing that with you at the earliest stage, so actually that the feedback was clear and the emerging findings were being discussed. And at the end of the inspection, when all the evidence has been secured and the provider is happy that they've shared all the relevant information that demonstrates their setting on a typical day, a full final grading discussion will take place with the leaders. This can be combined with what was normally the final feedback meeting, so it depends on the type and size of the setting, but it's in the guidance it's clear that those two meetings can be combined. Inspectors will make provisional judgments, and I'll explain that in feedback, and that's in the guidance. Obviously, any provisional gradings they made are subject to Ofsted quality assurance, and that was similar to previous frameworks as well, so that's not new. But when inspectors are making judgments, they use the toolkit grading criteria to make secure fit, and that's really important. That's a new element of this framework. It's very much not a best fit, it's a secure fit. And what inspectors will do first is look at the grading for expected standard for all the grading areas, and then look to see whether that's securely met, and it might be higher than that, or there's elements of that aren't quite met, and it might go to the lower judgment. So that toolkit is used very much on a transparent basis with you as part of those grading discussions. And this is the typical terminology that might be used to help inspectors make those judgments. So for anything that's very inconsistent and it's got a negative impact on children, it's likely to be a best fit for the needs attention or secure fit. The expected standard is where inspectors would always look first, and that shows the typical practice in a setting that's got a positive impact. If it's stronger than that, it's consistently applied and has a highly impactful impact on provision, and that would fit more securely in the strong standard. But if you look at the toolkit in more detail, you can very clearly familiarise yourself with the different criteria, and that will help you understand how inspectors make those judgments. So what now? I think the key findings from the guidance that I've taken is a really important element of you understanding the community that you serve, and identifying who the children are in your setting who potentially are more vulnerable than others. And that might change with different family circumstances, different children coming into your setting over time, but you just have to have that constant review of who potentially is more at risk than others. Think about who might need extra help. Where are the barriers to their learning and success and achievement? What are those barriers, and how can you overcome them within your curriculum and your programme of activities? Really importantly, you constantly evaluate how well you're doing. How successful is your provision? How do you know that? How do you know what's working well? Why is that? What have you done to do that? What changes have you made that have had a really positive impact? How do you know that you're closing gaps on children's learning? Really think about what you do each day and measure the impact that it has so that you're ready to share that with an inspector. Then think about what you need to improve next. What are your next steps for development? What are your priority improvement areas? How are you going to address those? How will you know when they're successful? And how can you link that to children's development as well? So think about that onward improvement journey that you as a provider want to make. And really become familiar with the inspection toolkit and the operating guidance, because they're published documents. It's what inspectors use. If you're more familiar with those, it'll help you understand the inspection process well, and you can prepare a bit better. And the final part, best advice, is don't panic. Use this as your time to show off your setting. You know your setting better than anyone else. Use the day to celebrate what you do, celebrate your children's achievements, and be able to demonstrate that with the inspector and share those positive aspects. Be reflective, be open, be transparent, know your setting, and carefully explain what you want to do next.